Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see all of you here, bright and early on a Saturday morning. I want to thank you all for coming to the APPAM Spring Conference for 2015 with our theme, Bridging the Gap, Research, Policy, and Practice. This year's theme is a continuation of sort of the sequencing of the spring conferences, if you will, at APPAM, where we really try and focus on some of the big professional issues. Sometimes it's pedagogical. This year it's focusing on the practice in the profession of public policy and the ways that the policy research community can influence the public policy debate. This year's conference obviously is the result of a lot of hard work and contributions from individuals. My name is Mike Shires, by the way, forgot to introduce myself. I'm from Pepperdine University, and I'm the past chair of the Council of Institutional Representatives. And so it's been my privilege to work with Angela Evans from the University of Texas, the LBJ School, to put this conference together. It's also partially my fault why you're here at 7:30 on a Saturday morning. If it makes you feel any better, I'm from the West Coast, so it's 4:30 for me. But the reason we did it, and you'll see as this day unfolds, is that we had a tremendous volume of fantastic material for today's event. And to put together a one-day conference like this and have the quality of opportunities to have presenters and sessions talking about issues, we just had to squeeze a lot into a very short period of time. And so I just want to take 2 seconds to thank not only Angela, but also Tara Sheehan, the executive director of APPAM, who single-handedly carries these events on her shoulders. And also, we had a great committee to put this event together. Swati Desai from SUNY, Charles Betsy from Howard, Cynthia Osborne from the LBJ School, Sarah Cordes from NYU, and Laura Peck from Abt Associates. I just want to thank all of them for their hard work in putting this event together. With kind of that context of all the hard work that's here, we want to turn to the conversation of the hard work of public policy and how we get the research and the scholarship and the sweat equity, if you will, of research institutions, both in the academic and in the public and nonprofit sectors, how we get that work to improve the policy outcomes that we're all working for. And so our first panel is really going to set the stage for today's conference. Angela's going to moderate it, so I'll let her introduce the speakers. But our goal in this process really is to set a stage for a dialogue about how the policy-making community interacts with the policy research and the policy analysis communities to really provide better outcomes for our societies, not just in the United States and not just at the federal level, but one of the great things about today's conference, we have representation from all levels, from the state and local level, from international settings, and from the national setting. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Angela, my co-chair for this event, and let her moderate our first panel. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. So these are the really strong stalwarts who get up at 7:30 or earlier to come here, because we're supposed to have a full house, about 140. This is the largest, I think, in my memory, of folks who came to the spring conference. So obviously this is a very important area in people's minds, and we have a long way to go to make sure that we're working very well to sustain the bridge that we can create between the evidence and knowledge in the university community and academia, and how that's generated and how they can move over to the policymaking community. So today's opening session, as Michael said, is a representation of different sectors that are involved in looking at research in terms of how research can make a difference in people's lives. So we have, I'm going to introduce the panel in alphabetical order. That's how they're listed in the brochure. So the first is John Barron, and John is currently with the Coalition of Evidence-Based Policy, but soon to join the Arnold Foundation. And the coalition starts with a lot of work on government effectiveness. The theme here is evidence-based. How do you use evaluations and really sound research to bring that knowledge into public policy? And so John is going to be joining as this week, Wednesday, tax day, April 15th, the Laura and John Arnold Foundation to establish a presence here in Washington, D.C. And their mission is, and I'm quoting, to produce substantial, widespread, lasting reform that will maximize opportunities and minimize injustice in our society. So it's a very noble goal, and this is going to be based on facts, evidence, and trying to bring that to bear on public policy. The second person is Melissa Kearney, and Melissa is from Brookings, so we have we're having a foundation, and now we have a think tank. And she's the director of the Hamilton Project. And if you haven't heard of the Hamilton Project, you need to hear about it. It's pretty special. The purpose is to produce innovative policy proposals on how to create a growing economy that benefits Americans. And they put what they're doing is, my understanding, and which I think is really wonderful, is taking some of the best knowledge that is created by economists and economic theory and research and bringing that to bear on public policy. So Melissa will talk a little bit about that. And then Brendan, we're out of order a little bit. Brendan is as our federal rep, and then Brendan told me, and Tara can verify this, that the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation at the Administrator for Children and Families is the only institutional member from the federal government. Oh, CR. Oh, I should have known that. Okay. Anyway, so Brendan has been doing a lot of work in terms of children and families. And again, the same theme you're going to see throughout this panel is the importance of research and evaluation and synthesizing that research and trying to bring that knowledge to bear on programs that he and his agency are responsible for, not only in terms of better implementation, but feeding on whether that implementation really makes a difference in terms of what their policy agenda really is supposed to be. And then there's Jim. And Jim is from academia. So this is Notre Dame, and this is the Wilson Sheehan Lab for Economic Opportunities, LEO, at Notre Dame. And this is a network. This is an interesting network. It's a research center, but it networks with folks around the country. Again, it's located in the Department of Economics, but it uses impact evaluations to identify innovative, scalable, effective programs. So again, we're getting into research, scalable, effective research. And the focus is on poverty. So Jim is going to join us today with that from academia. And last but not least is Don Wolfensberger, and I've known Don for a very long time. Don is a congressional scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, as well as a resident scholar at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And Don is very committed to Congress and the study of Congress and how deliberations take place in Congress. He was in the Congress for 28 years, started as a legislative assistant in a personal office and moved his way all the way up to what I consider one of the most powerful positions in the United States House of Representatives, and that is a staff director for the Rules Committee. And Don has been involved in trying to bring the knowledge to bear that's out there in academia into making good public policy decisions. So what we're going to do today is we're going to hear from them in terms of their experiences and how they have been able to use research, some of their challenges, some of the frustrations that they've had with that, some of the successes, how they see the best ways to disseminate that research that we can make a difference in the policy community. And we're really interested in hearing from them about how APPAM and the members in APPAM can better support these kinds of efforts. So I'm going to start with John, and we're going to do it alphabetically, so John can come up. I'm asking each speaker to come to the microphone because this way people in the back, the way the room is set up, you might not be able to see John from way back there. So why don't we just come up here, and then we'll do the Q&As at the end, okay? John?
So I was asked to talk for no more than 7 minutes about some examples of how research has informed. Let me just look at my watch to give the illusion that I'm going to stay within the time limit. Okay, so I'm going to talk, give a few examples of how research has informed policy, and then some thoughts on what foundations can do, on what APPAM can do, the field can do to try to increase the impact of research on policy. So the first example I want to talk about is one that I think is particularly important, and it's helping to shape our thinking at the Arnold Foundation, a possible new initiative. This one was an example, an MDRC study that was done in the late 80s, early 90s, the California GAIN evaluation of 9 different welfare to work programs in California, in 9 different counties. Each county had a different program. They were all randomized evaluations. And they found across the 9 counties there were some modest effects, some weak effects, some counties had no impacts, but one county, Riverside, California, had very large impacts. It was found the program, which focused on providing short-term job training and job search assistance, moving people into the workforce quickly, produced roughly a 40% increase in employment and earnings for single-parent long-term welfare recipients, sustained over 5 years, and savings of about $6,000 to the government in reduced food stamps and welfare, which was way larger than the other counties. And at the time, some folks thought it might be a fluke. Maybe it's a chance finding. If you do enough studies, you're going to find some positive effects like that just by chance, or it could be something unique to Riverside. But then Los Angeles County, whose program had been found to have almost no impact, decided to adopt Riverside's model, the key elements, implement it county-wide in a county that at the time had the largest welfare population in the United States. So it was a very large-scale replication. MDRC did a trial of that program, and it was found to produce very large impacts, not quite as large as Riverside, but about a 25% increase in employment and earnings and sizable savings to the government. Now, and those studies, and others that followed, some that ACF funded, a number that ACF funded, had an important impact on national policy, as many of you may know, in demonstrating that work-focused welfare-to-work programs could produce sizable effects and some savings to the government. It had an impact. Those findings had an impact on the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. So one thing that I think is particularly uniquely valuable about this example is it helps to answer the skeptic who says that all of this rigorous evaluation stuff, evidence-based policy, is just a bunch of hand-waving and promises and public works projects for academics. It shows that reproducing strong evidence can begin to move the dial on important national problems on a fairly sizable scale. So there are other Riversides out there in different areas of policy, large impacts shown in convincing studies, and one idea that we're exploring at the Arnold Foundation is to see if we could do a competition or something like that to try to get faithful replications of those examples of sizable programs producing sizable impacts on a large scale with existing public funds, as was done in Los Angeles, to get a few more of those examples of how, in short, using strong evidence can begin to move the dial on important national problems. It's not just a promissory note. So that's one thought. A second example of a more recent example of where research has influenced policy is a program that you might be familiar with, the Nurse-Family Partnership, a nurse home visitation program that has been shown in 3 different well-conducted randomized trials to produce sizable impacts, sustained impacts, reductions of 20 to 50% in rates of child maltreatment, and for the most vulnerable, children of the most vulnerable mothers, an increase in their educational and cognitive outcomes sustained through elementary school. And that program, it led to, first, the establishment of an evidence-based home visitation program under the Bush administration, a small pilot program, which was subsequently scaled up at HHS into its existing evidence-based home visitation program, about a $400 million a year program in the Obama administration. So it has bipartisan roots. That's one of a number of tiered evidence programs that have been enacted into policy in recent years. But it really, there's no question about it that the findings from the Nurse-Family Partnership had a major impact on national policy. So here's a sort of a general thought that the Arnold Foundation is thinking about in terms of a strategy. They're looking to fund additional randomized experiments in different areas of policy. The general thought is that our approach, and perhaps this could be useful in thinking about it for the field more generally, is that the field may need to be more strategic in its research investments, recognizing a fundamental and persistent truth, which is that when rigorous evaluations are done on a large scale, like the kinds I've described, very often they find that the program does not produce the hoped-for effects. And that's true in business. Jim Manzi wrote a book reporting that of Google and Microsoft randomized trials that they've sponsored of different business strategies, 13,000 trials over the past few years, 80 to 90% of them have found no significant effects for the strategy that was being tested. In Manzi's words, innovative ideas rarely work. The same thing is true in medicine. There have been reviews showing that only a small percentage of promising findings in medicine, fewer than half, are confirmed when a large randomized trial is done, which is required for a phase 3 trial to get FDA approval. The same thing is true in social policy. We did a review of the randomized experiments that the Department of Education has funded since 2002, and close to 90% of the large field trials found that the intervention being tested did no better than what the schools were doing already. So the thought, which I'm going to close on here, is that perhaps the field needs to be more strategic. We're thinking about doing many more low-cost randomized trials, cast a wide net to identify promising programs that show initial impacts, and then funding the more comprehensive studies only when there's a very strong signal from prior research that a positive impact could be found. And I think that's something, recognizing that fundamental problem that a lot of things don't work when they're rigorously tested is something that would be valuable for the field to keep in mind as in thinking about research funding and investments and so on. Thank you.
Morning. Thanks to APPAM for the opportunity to be here this morning. I'm wearing multiple hats in the sense that I have a shared allegiance to the Hamilton Project and to Leo, of which I'm a huge fan and am privileged to be involved. But I'm going to talk specifically about my experience with the Hamilton Project at Brookings. And I think it's worth noting that I come to Hamilton as an academic from the University of Maryland, and so that's the perspective I bring. So what the Hamilton Project is an economic policy group. We're at Brookings. We're officially a center at Brookings. And in my view, what makes it, the reason why it was so attractive to me is it really sits at the nexus of the academic, economic world and the policy world. So our main bread and butter and our reason for existing is to bring evidence-based, innovative policy ideas into the policy discussion. Traditionally, that has meant the DC policy discussion, for better or worse. I'd love for us to do more at the state and local level, but we're a small staff of 8 people, and it's just really hard to figure out how to expand in that way. So I want to make clear that when I say the policy world, I very much mean that the DC federal government policy world, though I hope we can expand in years to come. And what we do mainly is solicit commissioned papers from leading scholars on any given topic. And our topic areas are very widespread and diverse. So in the past 2 years, we've taken on the topics of poverty relief, addressing the water crisis in the West, the efficient allocation of the wireless spectrum, improving the efficiency of the U.S. fishing industry, how to expand employment opportunities, among others. And the way we're able to do this with a small staff is by tapping scholars all over the country. And so that's, I think, really the brilliance of the model that the founders of the Hamilton Project came up with 10 years ago, which is there are folks at their universities who have been studying policy questions for 10, 15, 20 years and don't have a voice in the policy world. And so Hamilton tries to bring those scholars that platform. The challenge, of course, is that academics, we're not trained to write digestible, accessible policy proposals. And so that's the value added of the Hamilton Project staff is we identify scholars who we think would be good at this and have a lot to say. And over the course of sort of a 6 to 9 month period, we work very closely with them to help craft an accessible policy proposal. It's painful at times. I mean, I remember when I was an author and I wrote a tax policy proposal, and then the Hamilton staff came back to me before I was director and said, you can't use the word labor supply elasticity. And I was like, well, nobody should be writing tax policy who doesn't know what labor supply elasticity is. And then when I went to give my briefing on the Hill, I was like, oh my God, they're writing tax policy and they don't know what labor supply elasticity is, right? So that's our value added. At the end, the authors are grateful, but there's that tension as we go along. The reason why it works is because we bring in policy stakeholders throughout the process. And we've used the expertise of many in the room. I'm seeing familiar faces to say, can you read this? Is this feasible? What does your agency expertise say about the feasibility of asking your agency to do this? Because we really do try and have the policy proposals be specific. They all come in the first draft. Policymakers should. And then we say, which policymaker? Right? And through what governance, how do they do that? And so we rely on really the generosity and time of stakeholders from agencies, from the Hill, who will comment on our proposals. And that's how we make sure the proposals we're putting out are sensible. The other products we put out, we do some in-house analysis. We'll put out 2 types of documents. And I brazenly brought a Hamilton folder for you guys to see for those who are interested. I have an example of a discussion paper in there. I have an example of a set of facts and a framing paper. So with each set of papers, we try to put out something in-house that frames the issue in an economic way. So for example, last May, we had a bunch of APPAM scholars write papers for us on reducing incarceration without increasing crime. That was Michael Stoll and Stephen Raphael. And we had Jens Ludwig and a co-author write something about how to reduce juvenile crime. To accompany those commissioned papers, the Hamilton Project put out 10 economic facts about crime and incarceration in the U.S. And what's interesting about this, and I think why the facts were so well received, is because we're not an advocacy group, we're not a crim justice group. We framed the issue of crime and incarceration in an economic way. I'm sort of responsible for the intellectual content at Hamilton, and as an academic economist, there's only so many things I'm willing to say. And so we like to think that also sets us apart, right? I kept getting pushed. Someone wanted me to say something very specific about the economic cost of incarceration. I couldn't find a causal estimate in the literature that I believed, and so that's sort of conspicuously missing. But it does mean that when we do put out facts in framing paper, it really does reflect, in our view, sort of the best state of the rigorous evidence. And the other type of product we'll put out are sort of simple economic analyses when we feel like there's some debate going on in the press and it's muddled, and if someone just really carefully looked at CPS data, we can actually say something honest about what the data says. So we try to do that as well. The last thing I want to say about the Hamilton project is we try to influence policy and the policy conversation. And we do that in 2 ways. One, we do it with the policy-focused products that we put out, as I just mentioned, but we also do it by releasing our papers with pretty high-profile public events. And this is a way to get people to pay attention to the papers we're putting out at any given time. So, for example, last month we commissioned 3 papers from leading academics on the issues of ways to increase expanding employment opportunities. If we just stuck them on our website, it's not clear how much attention they would get. Instead, we rolled them out at a public event at the press club. We had Vice President Biden keynote, and that immediately gets press attention. So press wrote up the papers, talked to the authors. It generated interest in those papers and that topics at the time. There's an important, I don't know if it's footnote, maybe it's bigger than footnote, that I want to say about this. This has been eye-opening to me as an academic. I always marveled, how does the Hamilton Project get folks like Biden to come, Larry Summers to sit on a panel, which really does generate attention and sort of amplify the effect, I think, and influence that our small shop and our very good content has. And the answer there is really we have a very high-profile, active expert advisory council. And for better or worse, right, as an academic, I was like, I might send a letter to the Bill Clinton's office, and he's probably going to ignore it. But when it comes from our advisory council, which is really made up of illustrious folks, that helps amplify our influence. So there's a bit of honesty there. Okay, so I have thoughts about how I think APPAM complements and is different from Hamilton, but presumably we'll talk about that on the panel. So thanks.
Thanks, Angela, for the invitation, or to the few in the audience who I've seen who may be on the program committee and who nominated me. I'll get you back. So I'm Brendan Kelly. I'm from the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation at the Administration for Children and Families. Our office serves, and my director, Naomi Goldstein, serves as the principal advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Children and Families on all topics of research and evaluation. And for those who don't know what ACF does, imagine all the social welfare programs, take out education, take out the food programs, take out the largest program, which is the EITC, and basically end job training that DOL does. Basically, after that, ACF has pretty much everything else. Early care and education, we now have home visiting. We do teen pregnancy, we do child care, child support, cash welfare, what little there is left of it, and a host of other programs as well. So across the office, we deal with, prenatal issues all the way till, people are probably making their retirement decisions. So that's what we do. How we do it is actually mostly through grants and contracts. We have a pretty small shop, about, it's growing. It's about 40 of us, professional staff. We do most of it through grants and contracts, and I see a number of folks in the audience who have been either recipients of OPRE grants or who work with us on contracts. We could not do the work we do without them, because of them. We've been in charge of work that included the welfare waiver experiments, the Head Start Impact Study, which some people may know about, the healthy marriage experiments, including building strong families and supporting healthy marriage. But we also do a number of large-scale surveys, recent National Survey of Early Care and Education, and the National Survey of Child and Adolescent Well-Being. So most of our stuff is randomized trials. Actually, we've been doing randomized trials, I would say, before they were popular. Probably back when they were unpopular. In fact, if you've read Judy Groen and Howard Ralston's recent book, that details in much more, the blood and the gore is, I think, pretty much left out of the book, but it'll give you the good sense of what happened in the pulling and cajoling that led to the results that John was referring to earlier. The other thing about how we do it is we have a ACF evaluation policy, and a couple of principles in the evaluation policy are rigor, relevance, and transparency. And I think all three of those, the whole evaluation policy stems toward how we think policymakers and researchers should get along. But I think that particularly the rigor and relevance go together because we try to do the most rigorous research, but recognize that rigorous research that comes a day too late is not always relevant. But also that transparency is a critical piece to connecting research and policymaking. That means from simple things like don't bury reports to being transparent in our research methods. And I think that's one of the reasons we do experiments much more than we do quasi-experimental work is because it's just much easier to be transparent about we randomly assign a bunch of people than, here are 12 equations that you don't remember how to do. But it also, I think, leads to another challenge, which is transparency in meaning. In meaning. So if we produce a report that is 100 pages long, well, probably we've cut it down, but nobody is going to read those reports. And so we've tried and are trying to go toward publications that are, I would say, more transparent by being easier, more accessible, and written in plainer language. To illustrate that, I would tell a brief story that follows nicely with what John was saying about California and gain. But to illustrate how after welfare reform has gone in terms of the research and evaluation world. So picking up where John left off, the welfare waiver experiments happened. And in addition to them, there were a bunch of other studies, the New Hope study, the MFIP study, the Canadian SSP study, that all had pretty consistent results. Now, while they differed in some ways, and we can quibble about some of the findings, I think it was the consistency of results pulled together, and I see Carolyn Hill here, through great pieces such as the Bloomhill-Riccio article that was the APPAM Vernon Award winner in 2003. Am I right about that? Somewhere in there. But that OPRE helped put some money up for. But also there were a group of researchers who were interested in child outcomes. Some from the state waiver experiments that OPRE supported. Others were supported through the Next Generation project at MDRC. And I think, and I would amend John's telling of the history just a bit. It wasn't just that gain and other places show that work could work. It was also that the experiments showed that if they were to move mothers to work, that kids wouldn't be, as bad off. It wasn't that just that, in some cases there were positive results, but it was that piece, the fact that kids weren't also as bad off, the sort of a non-finding, if you will, that I think has also been instrumental in and a useful bit of the experimental research that has led us going forward. Moving forward from that, then states implemented the law that Ron Haskins, whether or not you like it or not, you can blame Ron for the law. And states focused primarily on two things. They focused on caseload reduction and work participation. And now, as much as I am a fan of experimental research, if you looked at the caseload reduction numbers in every single experimental study, and then you gave people a chance to guess at what the results would look like when states went out and implemented the laws based on those experimental results, you would have been widely off. You'd have missed the whole story. The experimental results couldn't even get you anywhere close to what states did. Caseloads dropped dramatically. In addition to that, the experimental research also missed some of the story on work participation. And it missed it in two ways. First, by treating it only in an experimental context, it ignored the fact that we live in a much broader world, and that the overall economy, once the experiments are over, is going to have some effect on the policies as they're implemented. In addition, there are funny people like bureaucrats who then are out there implementing the law. And I think part of the reason you saw the caseload reduction and part of the reason that you saw work participation the way it was is because the bureaucrats implementing the law basically were stricter and more rigorous in their implementation of it. Fast forward then to the present day, well, as close to present day as we got. And in that time period between welfare reform and about 2007, there were a lot of individual isolated random assignment studies that we in MDRC and other places produced. But they didn't really lead to any substantive change, in part because of the 20 or so that we supported. Only about 4 to 5 found results, including one that had a home visiting component, building Nebraska families. Then in 2007, we launched our next generation project, which was called ISIS up until earlier this year. It's now PACE, Pathways for Advancing Careers in Education. So we're no longer recruiting for ISIS. We're on the firm to the PACE. But back when PACE was started, the research team led by APT Associates said, we're going to do 3 things differently. First, we're going to test a few things well. We're not going to go off and look for all the possible things. We're going to test a few things, and we're going to test them well. Second, by doing this, we're going to have results like the child outcome study, like Bloom-Hill-Riccio, where the whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts. And third, we're going to engage the policy community closely throughout the evaluation process. And what APP did was they brought on the National Governors Association, the National Conference of State Legislatures, and APHSA as parts of the research team. They weren't just consultants out there who would be, come in every once in a while. They were intimately involved in the research design. The fourth thing that happened, and I'll wrap up quickly, then is throughout the course, as we were recruiting sites, we changed the name of, or we changed how we referred to sites. Instead of being demonstration sites, they were now demonstration partners. And that little wording change has had a profound influence in both the relationship between the researchers and the participating organizations, but also it has created a whole set of, a whole network, if you will, of surrogates for the research. So it's not just APT or any of the other researchers, or OPRE, who's out there talking about these results when they do come out. It'll be us and 9 other organizations. And with that, I think those sort of differences illustrate some of the possibilities for how other federal agencies or other agencies in general could do some of this going forward. Thanks, Angela.
Good morning, and I wanted to thank Tara and Angela for inviting me to be part of this conversation, because I was really excited when they contacted me, because this idea of building bridges is something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, particularly building the bridge between practitioners and researchers, because just a couple years ago, together with a colleague of mine, Bill Evans at the University of Notre Dame, we launched the Lab for Economic Opportunities, or LEO, which is a center designed to find research-based poverty solutions here in the United States. And the motivation for launching this lab grew out of a partnership with Catholic Charities USA, which is, as a network, the largest private provider of services to the poor in the United States. They touch 1 in 4 in poverty in programs in more than 180 cities across the country. And through this partnership, we were introduced to local agencies all across the country. And in that process, we learned a lot about the nonprofit human services sector. First, we learned that this is a very big sector that provides more than $200 billion worth of services to the poor each year. But one thing that came up in these conversations again and again was how sincerely interested these agencies were in being able to find a way to articulate the impact of what they were doing. How do we communicate that what we're doing is making a difference? One, so that we can communicate this to donors and to foundations and to government agencies, but also because they were genuinely interested in knowing whether or not what they were doing was making a difference, and being able to ensure that with their limited resources, they were making the biggest difference possible. And so Bill and I were struck by that, in particular because we knew that there were all these researchers out there who would love to gain access to the data and programs that these agencies were overseeing and implementing. And so you had this problem where you have all these service providers who want more information about the effectiveness of programs, and you have researchers who want to study the effectiveness of these programs. And the problem was that these two groups weren't talking to each other. So with that, we launched the Lab for Economic Opportunities, and we think of this as playing the role of matchmaker. This is there are far too many service providers out there interested in building projects for just Bill and I or even the University of Notre Dame to handle this. So we've established this as a research network where Leo is the matchmaker. We, through our contacts with agencies, cities, and states, we identify potentially innovative programs that really are in need of evidence of their effectiveness. And then we go find the leading researcher, the scholar working on these kinds of questions, and invite them to come on board and be part of a research project that rigorously evaluates the impact of that program. So let me give you one example so you can kind of see how this works. In parts of these visits to agencies, we visited Catholic Charities Fort Worth in Fort Worth, Texas, and they were telling us about how they had just designed a brand new program that aims to keep kids, low-income kids, in community college, because at Tarrant County College in Fort Worth, Texas, the dropout rate was 90% for first-time, full-time enrollees. And they wanted to do something about this to try and help move these kids towards self-sufficiency. So they designed a program that provides comprehensive case management services to help these kids address a lot of the reasons why they drop out in the first place, which turns out not so much to be driven by academic or by financial cost of tuition reasons, which is the focus of a lot of policy. But what ends up happening is that life gets in the way, that other events occur in their lives, that it's as simple as their car breaks down, or a parent gets sick, or in one case in this study was a student who couldn't see the blackboard and couldn't afford a new eyeglass prescription. And these are the kinds of services that local service providers provide. And they had designed this program, and they really wanted to know, will this program work? What is the impact of this program? So at the same time, we had been in conversations with Melissa Kearney, who about her interests in promoting more effective outcomes at community colleges. So we invited Melissa to join us in conversations with Catholic Charities Fort Worth, and we launched a full-scale randomized controlled trial evaluation of this program, where Catholic Charities introduced us to the community college, and the community college gave us the data of eligible participants, and we randomly selected which ones would be invited to the program, and were able to track outcomes over time. We're 3 semesters into this program now, and the evidence, the early results are actually quite promising, and it's those early results that have played a big part in allowing us to scale up this program to a larger demonstration project that we're going to roll out at a new campus. So the idea of LEO is to encourage these partnerships between researchers and practitioners so that we can implement these kinds of rigorous scientific evaluations all across the country. And a natural question then is, well, what do we do with these results? Because all too often I think researchers kind of end with the research publication. And I think that speaks to the importance and the dividends that can pay off when researchers partner with a large network of providers. So in the case of partnering with Catholic Charities, the largest private provider of services in the U.S., we have an infrastructure in place to scale up effective programs. So once we find out that a program works in Chicago, we can implement it at an agency in New York or in California. We presented some early results from one of our projects at an annual gathering of service providers where there were 1,000 service providers in the room. And that opportunity to talk about research results to a large network of providers it just increases the scale of the impact of this kind of research. In fact, next week, Catholic Charities Fort Worth has invited 25 service providers to come to their agency, and they're going to present this community college program, and we're going to present the research evidence of its impact, the early results, so that these providers can go home and implement it in their own communities. So this ability to scale up these interventions is much greater when you partner with a network of providers. The other key component here is disseminating this to policymakers. And actually, when we first launched this, we talked with Melissa, and she said, "Great, we can for each of these projects, we can have a Hamilton project paper that will talk about the results that Leo does." And I think in many ways, places like Hamilton are critical for helping us get this evidence to policymakers. But I also want to talk about this bridge between practitioners and policymakers, because they often have access to policymakers that, well, as a researcher, I had very little access to or ability to disseminate results directly to policymakers. But it turns out that local service providers have very strong ties with their city governments and with state governments, and are a natural conduit to disseminate information on what kinds of programs work to those governments. But also as a national network like Catholic Charities USA, they have the ability to disseminate these results to Capitol Hill. And in fact, our partners in Fort Worth testified in front of the House Budget Committee last year about a program that we're evaluating, and that came about because of the partnership that their national network has. So I want to just wrap up by making one final comment about something that we've learned in this process of building these partnerships with local agencies, and that is that to many of these agencies, research is really scary. And they hear about this idea that, oh, you're gonna do what? You're gonna randomly select these people? We can't do that. And even though they're running lotteries, they say, no, we can't run a randomized control trial. And one service provider once told me that research is a virus, and once it gets into your agency, it takes over and distracts you from what you're doing. And so I see a big part of the goal of what Leo wants to do is help practitioners understand that research isn't a virus, and really by building these partnerships between researchers and service providers, you really can benefit the mission of both of these groups, and I really see that's a way that APPAM can play a big role, right? So to providing a platform where researchers and service providers and practitioners can come together and talk about it. I think the more that there's comfort about understanding about what research is and how it can help them, I think the more that we're going to see these kinds of research projects. One example, we're partnering with the Jameel Poverty Action Lab of North America to start these training sessions where we invite practitioners to come and learn about what a randomized control trial is, so that they're more comfortable about this when we start talking about it. And I think that by building this kind of comfort, we're only going to see more evidence-based program design and policy design. Thanks.
Good morning. One of the dangers of being the last person on a panel, I think, was best captured by the French writer André Gide. I don't know if he's in a similar situation, but it sounds like it. He said that everything that needs to be said has already been said, but since no one was listening, it needs to be said again. Well, I can't say that because, A, everybody here was paying rapt attention. I was watching, notwithstanding the hour of the day. But secondly, there's no way I could get close to the weeds that these people have been in as far as the policy-making aspects and the research that's being done. So I'm coming at it from a little different angle, that of the Congress. And I thought to dramatize this, I would give my 7-minute talk a little title. And it's called How to Get the Attention of Policy Makers Who Are Increasingly Inattentive to Policy Making. And that's what Congress is. That's what's happened. As Angela mentioned, I spent 28 years on the Hill, mostly with the House Rules Committee, and the last 17 years I've been in the think tank world trying to figure out what it was that we were doing back then, but also, more importantly, trying to figure out how things have changed since then, what's going on. And so that's something that I'm constantly studying. I don't have to go into the whole litany of how it has changed or why it has changed, but I think it's best captured with some terms that I'll revive. I don't know if they're being used anymore or not, but when I was on the Hill, we would refer to the policy staffers as the pencil heads. Those of us that were in the process procedure world of the Rules Committee were sort of the propeller heads, how to make things go, how to make them happen. But there was another term that didn't come about then, and I had to invent it this week in preparing these remarks, and that is the actors that are increasingly taking over on the Hill, and that are the political staffers. And the best way to bring this out is Roll Call newspaper. I write a column for Roll Call every other week. But twice a year, they do something called the Fabulous 50 Staffers. They started this back in 1982, and at that time, about 60% of the staffers they listed as the most important staff on the Hill, House, Senate, Republicans, Democrats, were committee staff. More recently, and I've been keeping track of this, it's only about 25% committee staff and about 75% leadership staff. And if you look at these, some of the leaders have 2 or 3 people on the list, and they're all in communications. So it's really today about messaging, and it's about the permanent campaign and the fact that Congress is spending less time really deliberating and doing policy making, but more interested in the next election and how do we get the message out this week. And so that is the, I think, increasingly difficult challenge for those of you who are doing policy relevant research to get it across to a crowd that is less interested than ever in policy research. I talked to one of my friends at the Congressional Research Service a couple of years ago, and I said, are you still doing those fantastic reports that I used to enjoy when we were preparing hearings on one thing or another? And he said, well, we'd like to, but the members of Congress aren't really interested in them. They want, instead of the things that we used to do, which had a lot of historical context, what has gone before, what has worked, what hasn't worked, they want a 2-pager. What's the current problem? What are the options for solving the problem? So that's a big switch. My book also sort of tells this story, my one and only book published in 2000. It's called Congress and the People, Deliberative Democracy on Trial, and how deliberation has declined as Congress has become increasingly partisan. So Angela's asked me just to give a couple examples of how things worked, at least when I was on the staff, and then a couple of suggestions of how you might bridge that gap between the research world and the world of the Congress. The Rules Committee, even though it spends most of its time putting out special rules for bills from other committees to bring to the floor, telling how much debate time and amendments and so on, has something called original jurisdiction. And we used to spend a lot more time on our original jurisdiction, is how to improve the institution, how to amend the standing rules so that Congress does a better job of deliberating, of oversight, and so on. And so we had a number of very good hearings where we drew on the research community and bringing in witnesses, and we had the advantage, which a lot of folks don't in let's say, the executive branch, of having the Congressional Research Service where Angela served. And what we would do is, they would used to put out lists of journal articles that would be relevant, not just for committee staff, but for members, regular individual staff, as to what articles in your area of interest have been published in the last month. And so I would check off the ones, whether it's on regulatory reform or budget process reform or communications in the legislature, whatever, and they would send the articles, and I would sometimes synthesize those for my boss, or otherwise just take it into my file for when the time came to use that. I don't know if they still do that or not, but that was very useful. But the other thing that the CRS did was provide us their expert staff, both for testifying before our hearings, but also in flagging the important people on the outside that are doing relevant research in that area, so that we could draw upon them to come and testify and hopefully put things in plain English that members could understand. And usually it worked out pretty well. And I think that's pretty much how it still works when you do have subcommittee hearings and they're trying to do some oversight, or they're trying to find out how to proceed in a particular area, that they still use the CRS heavily in flagging those experts and bringing them to the Hill. So I think that's something very important to keep in mind, that we have that extra advantage where we don't have to go out searching in the weeds. The CRS is there keeping on top pretty much of the research that might be relevant to Congress's needs. The other thing that I want to mention is during the process of our hearings on the Rules Committee and into original jurisdiction, we not only brought people into Washington to testify, but we had field hearings where we would go out into the states, the districts of members, and look into a problem. And I remember specifically when we were looking at regulatory reform, how does Congress do a better job of oversight of the regulatory process in the executive branch? And we went to several members' districts, members who were on our committee, and held field hearings where we brought in the local officials, some state officials, university folks, how are regulations impacting the university community, and so on. And those were very helpful. So I know Congress still does some field hearings. I don't know whether it's as much as they used to, but that's something to keep an eye on. My 2 tips are this. 1, visit your member's office when the member is in the district. If you come to Washington with a wonderful group like this and you think you're going to get an appointment, get in and talk to the member, good luck. If you're very fortunate, you might get 2 or 3 minutes to say hello. You'll most likely be shunted off to a 24-year-old legislative assistant who is specializing in your area of interest. But members go back regularly to their districts, and they have district office hours. Pay a visit. a sort of a get to know the member and let them know what you're working on so that they keep you in mind if something comes up in their committee or on just in their general legislative responsibilities that you can be of help with. My second suggestion is look at Duke University's website on their communications, I don't know if it's called the communications office, but it's their public affairs office. As a columnist now for Roll Call, I get their news tips periodically because I'm on their list of journalists that they contact. So-and-so has done research in this area that's in the news today. If you would like to interview them, and they will have a little quote from them, give you the contact information, and so on. This is one of the best organized things that I have seen, and I don't have occasion for my column purposes to call those people up, but the point I'm trying to make is members now find out about the experts through the media. That is sort of the bridge. So if they see you quoted in the Washington Post or something because a reporter has followed up and contacted you, they will quite often keep that in mind when it's time to call witnesses for a hearing or to get further information from you for their own legislative projects. So that would be my second recommendation. And with that, I will sit down and we can entertain questions. Thank you.
So given the nature of this setup, what we're going to do is we're going to obviously take questions from the floor. I will repeat the questions, and then we have a mic here, and the person who you address the question to will respond to it, and any other panelists who'd like to make a comment. So it's all yours. So how do you deal with people who don't believe your research? Everybody believes the research, no? That's a good question. It's a good question. Who wants to take it?
So I'll say something. I mean, this. I haven't encountered this as much at Hamilton, but I've encountered it. I mean, it's fresh in my mind. Something like this happened to me yesterday. I have a new academic paper out. We haven't released it yet, but we've sort of quietly circulated it. It got to folks, practitioner types, who we know will be asked to comment on it. So we wanted to give them an advanced copy. They're not economists by training. So, you know, maybe not everyone in the room appreciates this, but some folks in social policy worlds don't like economists butting in their business. And so we were on the phone with a bunch of folks who work in early childhood education who were very irritated with us. And they were like, well, your methods have weaknesses too. And it was a bit of a heated conversation. I mean, I thought this was a friendly call. We sang our advanced copy of our paper. I wanted to talk about it. And my co-author and I spent about an hour trying to explain to them why economists approach things in a different way, how you can interpret our findings. I mean, it was more of a, let's get to know each other and appreciate each other's methods. Now, when the paper comes out, these people they will be asked about it, and they might issue a comment like, well, it's not peer-reviewed, and there's methodological weaknesses, and there's sort of nothing we can do about it. We tried to be preemptive and have an opportunity to explain to them why we think our methods are valid.
Can you just speak into the mic for recording? I'm sorry. And what you said was very important.
Of course. So, and I agree with that, but one thing I would add is that a lot of times people don't believe in your research because they don't want to believe, they don't like the result. And so that, in some sense, there's not much you can do there except just beat them over the head with the rigor of the research. And I think that, you know, the more that research, as John was talking about, the more that it can be replicated elsewhere, then the argument just becomes more and more convincing. But sometimes, you know, I think it's unproductive to try and convince somebody who doesn't agree with the methods of your research really because they don't want to buy the results.
I would disagree with that just a little. I actually think it goes to sort of first principles, and I think, for instance, politicians may disagree with the research not only because they don't like the results, but because for them truth comes through the will of the voter. And for researchers, the search for truth comes from a scientific method, and it's a very different way to approach something and how you think about what matters to the world. If on the one hand you're looking at a very long, lengthy, potentially fact-checking process versus something that, you know, in 2 years I know the result. I had a result or an experience a few years ago where I made the mistake of, at an Easter brunch, talking about education policy with a table full of teachers, all of whom were my family members, and I survived. No marks. But the mistake there was, for teachers, it's very, very difficult to talk about education policy because they come from a different worldview of how the truth is constructed. And truth is always constructed by one teacher, primarily, by one teacher's classroom experience. So even if you're making a statement, and policy statements are general statements, even if you're making a policy statement that says bad teachers shouldn't be in the classroom, good teachers have a hard time interpreting that because it just comes at the core of how they believe the world is constructed. And in this brunch conversation, here I was sitting with like award-winning teachers who were all not believing that principle should happen. So I think some people are going to not believe the research flat out because they don't want to. At other times, I think it's because we just have fundamentally different ways in which we look at the world, and you got to go at it that way.
Don, yeah.
I'll just take a brief crack at this. Yesterday I had the pleasure of talking to Professor Sean Theriot's students that he brings to Washington every Easter time for a week. One of the young ladies, one of the students asked me, is it true that Congress is less interested in the research work that's being done at think tanks like yours or at universities and so on? And I said, I think it's not a matter that they're antagonistic or antipathetic or whatever, but it's a time factor. They're spending more time running for re-election than they are looking at research that's relevant maybe to their subcommittee. And it's also a fact that when they do arrange committee hearings, each side has its own set of witnesses. It's like cherry picking the witness that comes closest to your point of view. And so you do get some balance then in the hearings because you have the majority witnesses and the minority witnesses. And so that's kind of how things work out.
Did you want to comment, John?
Yeah,
okay.
A quick comment. I want to go back to something that Brendan mentioned in his remarks, which was that if you come to a practitioner or a policymaker with a bunch of complicated equations, and here's the result, we produced an impact of such and such, essentially you're saying, trust me, I'm the expert coming down from the mountain, and here's the result. And I think there's good reason not to trust a lot of academics. I don't.
Were you waiting for a response?
Not the ones here, of course. that sounded a little harsh.
Yeah.
But people sometimes get carried away with their own methods, and they may have be searching for hoping for a particular result, and so on. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I think if you come to folks with a fairly simple study design, credible study design, like a large randomized trial, not trying to answer 6 different questions, simple, fairly simplified analyses that are valid, and then a table at the end of the day that says, well, here's the high school graduation rate for the kids in the treatment group, here's the graduation rate for the kids in the control group, and also showing maybe baseline equivalence. That's convincing. You don't have to be a researcher to understand that's a convincing study. So simple, credible, I think is more persuasive.
I just want to add 2 cents in here because I have to take the side of defending some of the professional staff on the Hill. We had 2 big forums about a month ago with the top leadership, as defined as professional staff on committees and leadership staff, and to the person, Republicans, Democrats, House, Senate, to the person said, we really want to get the best knowledge and expertise to us when we need it. And being from CRS, there's going to be people that you will never bring around, whether you have the most elegant, beautiful, accessible, transparent work. But then there's others that really want to do that. So I worry a little bit that people have this impression because of what you see in the news, but behind the scenes and people who are working on legislation really do. And I think you had some helpful advice here in terms of how to try to have access to that. So please don't get turned off by that, but I do think there's a lot of folks on the Hill who really are anxious to hear because they want to do the right thing. Yes, Larry? So I'm going to repeat the questions so that we can get this recorded. And so Larry Mead from NYU, Wagner, is talking about the limitation of the role of evaluations and the concern that if we focus too much on evaluations and not on other research that looks at ways of actually improving policy, we may be missing a large segment of what we're after here. Is that okay, Larry? Okay.
So I appreciate this question. I think this is an excellent observation, especially coming after the previous point, which I think is a valid one, which is a lot of academics produce fancy stuff that just isn't accessible.
Right.
But of course, it would make me profoundly sad if that's all just summarily dismissed, because some of it is exceptionally good and exceptionally insightful in a way that you can't get from randomized controlled trials. Furthermore, academics, most of us can't run a $5 million randomized controlled trial. And so we have other ways of using data with hundreds of thousands of observations and very carefully crafted econometric strategies to get at important policy parameters, insights of interest. So I think Larry is absolutely right that research needs to be brought to the conversation and brought to the policy world. The challenge is getting it there because of this issue. People don't believe it because they don't know how to interpret it. And so this is where I think APPAM can play a good role for researchers, for academics who are doing that kind of research on policy relevant topic. We are never trained at how do I make that digestible. I sort of like to think that in the academic world, I come to APPAM and I interact with this world and I try to talk to the policy world. But even I got stumped like last year in an embarrassing CNN interview when she was trying to ask me why is my answer right? And I just I went, it's fancy econometrics and it works, right? Because we don't actually know how to explain it. And I think that's a challenge, and that's something that academic researchers need to get better at. And potentially there's a way, I was thinking about this for APPAM, even if at the fall session there's a session on somebody who knows how to do this, giving academics tips on how to distill things. Or if there were sort of an APPAM newsletter with a column on how to make this digestible, how to explain certain concepts. I think that is a challenge, but it would be a lot of missed opportunities if we don't figure out how to rise to that challenge.
So I
I'm
want to
sorry.
just add one more thing, because I'm also really glad that Larry brought this up, because I think another big discovery we made in this process of launching LEO was that service providers all across the country have been running natural experiments and collecting data, and nobody's been doing anything with it because the service providers don't know that they're running the natural experiments, and the researchers aren't aware that they're keeping data and doing these things. I'll do one quick example. The Homeless Prevention Call Center in the city of Chicago takes all the calls from people about to get evicted from their apartments. It turns out that some days they have funding, some days they don't have funding. And it also turns out that when they process the call, they collect all the information to determine eligibility before they tell the person whether or not there's funding. So they have all of the data on who calls on a day when essentially by chance that they can help them, and by chance they can't. They had no idea that this is a researcher's dream come true, that you could run this natural experiment. And these kinds of studies are not being done because people don't know that they're out there. And so I don't think that we want to just restrict ourselves to kind of the most rigorous gold standard experimental studies, when a lot can be learned from these other kinds of approaches.
I would make one more point, which is, while it's true, Larry, that that evaluation is the only type of useful evidence, I think it's also too narrow to think that evaluation is just impact findings. If you look at any of the work that OPRE does, we have rich implementation studies. We have, in the PACE project that I mentioned earlier, we have Kristen Seefeld from the University of Michigan, who's doing, qualitative interviews with, 10 members of the treatment group and 5 members of the control group in all of our sites. I mean, actually, if I think about it, I think more of our research goes toward the non-impact parts of the evaluation than it actually does to the impact results. Now, those might be the ones that get the headline, but in fact, there's a lot that can be learned and a lot of insights from evaluation, even if they don't produce any experiment, or, any findings, which typically tends to be the case.
Okay. One last comment on John, and then I'm going to take Burl and then back there.
I agree with Larry's point that non-experimental research can be extremely valuable and complementary to experimental research. So just to give you a concrete example, there has been a lot of non-experimental research showing econometric research and so on, showing that teachers really make a difference in the classroom, the individual teacher, and that teacher value-added scores, how much they've improved their the test scores of their prior students, has an important is strongly correlated with the performance of their future students, and those effects are quite large. There is also more recently it led to an experimental study where it wasn't an intervention, but classrooms were randomly assigned to teachers in Los Angeles, and it confirmed that the teachers in the high value added produce much larger impacts for their students than the teachers in low value added. The next step, and that helps to inform the idea that yes, we need interventions to get better teachers into the classrooms. It's not something which is directly policy applicable yet, but it tells you that this is a really important area, putting good teachers in the classrooms. And that you need to test out, probably in experimental studies eventually, different teacher hiring interventions, different teacher professional development interventions, and so on, but that the benefit there can be large.
Thank you. Burl, did you have? And then Jody. Okay, I'm going to try to rephrase Burl's question. So get my glasses here for my notes. So we've been talking about, Burl's saying we've been talking about packaging, we've been talking about methodologies, but one thing we've missed in terms of what we've been trying to cover here is the complicated nature of our political structure, which is a relationship between the federal government, states, and localities, and how that political veneer can affect the way findings and research, first of all, design, and also how research findings can be implemented. Okay, so who'd like to take that?
Jim, I think Jim's remarks were very much on this in the sense that local practitioners are really important players, and in some sense figuring out a way to partner with local practitioners might be more effective in the anti-poverty world than trying to ask Congress to pass new legislation. So that's one way where I actually think the panel, in particular the work of the Lab for Economic Opportunities, is right on point. The point had also been made that Congress is busy with other activities, but I think that does get back to packaging in the sense that, folks on the Hill, they don't have the luxury of time to read all the literature, and so that does put a burden on those of us trying to influence policy to make it really accessible. But the third thing that I would say that I heard on the panel is trying to involve not just asking for federal action, but think about what agencies can do, what state and local governments can do, and producing research that informs those actors is potentially increasingly important. So,
anybody who's run experiments knows that external validity is probably one of the biggest threats to its general relevance, and so it's something that we worry about all the time. Whether or not we have an answer all the time is a different story, because it's really hard to generalize something that's done in kind of a laboratory-like setting. And but just kind of to build off what Melissa said, I do think that partnering at the local level and then also partnering with broader networks can really make a difference here. So I'm most familiar with the Catholic Charities Network. They think a lot about why some programs that are replicated at agencies in different cities are replicable and why in some cases they're not. Why in some cases it's because there was a dynamic agency that was able to pull this off, and in some cases, it wasn't dependent on the quality of the staff and these kinds of things. And I think that it's actually a really healthy conversation to be thinking about the external validity of these kinds of things, and the best way to address it is to replicate and test it again and verify that these things can be applied in different settings. And in fact, there's a lot of push for this kind of support. So IES and other government agencies that are funding these kinds of experiments are funding experiments that are just replication. So it's not a new study, but it's something that has been done before. And can we test that it can be done elsewhere?
I'm gonna go on because we have only 5 minutes, and we can engage in dialogue as we go through the day. Yes, Jody, or go ahead. No, whoever, choose. Okay, so Valerie's questions the comments are very well taken in terms of the incentives and disincentives that are present in university and academic settings, both for tenure and just for your evaluation as to whether or not you engage and how much that really matters. So we'll let that rest a minute, but your real question is, when you're talking about these kinds of evidence-based or any kind of research that's trying to help improve programs, when you look at the practitioners or the people who are actually implementing the programs, their concern is that it's going to take time and there's too much pressure on having immediate results or very quick results. Is that true? Is that the...
Much more eloquent.
Okay, so who would like to take that question?
I think it's a very, very good observation and insight. Actually, both of them. There is often, I think, too quick a jump to do an impact evaluation. We've seen this. We sponsor a low-cost randomized controlled trial competition, and a lot of the ideas that are proposed may be good ideas, but they are not. They haven't really passed the proof of concept stage, meaning, a lot of them are nudge interventions or whatever, trying to get, but whatever, if in a school, for instance, can you get teachers actually to follow the protocol? Can you get the students to participate, to complete the program and all of that? Those kinds of feasibility questions, in our view, are very important to answer so that you have something that you're confident is that you're not going to have intervention failure when you actually go ahead with an impact evaluation. And I think that message needs to get out there. A lot of times there's just, everybody wants to get to the strong evidence part quickly, but you're sabotaging yourself if you have something that's not sufficiently well implemented and promising to get to that stage.
Take one more comment on that.
Well, I would just add, I think there's a whole body of research that has yet to be tapped, or has started to be tapped, that is related to the does it work questions that are the focus of sort of the evidence-based policy movement. But it is a body of research that looks not at interventions that directly affect clients, but at interventions that affect staffing, organizational behavior, teacher development. I mean, if you think about it, caseworkers in a welfare office, a welfare caseworker has the potential to affect 80 to 100 clients. If we can improve, and if these interventions may be more costly, they may be less costly, but when you divide that effect over the number of students, clients, organizations that you have the potential, I think, to have some very, very profound change and changes that are easier to implement. And I think the research community just simply hasn't gone to look at that body of work enough. There have been a few places where I think it's been done, but I think that's part of the key, is to bring the research to where people really are.
Okay. So I'm sorry we can't take any more questions, but I have a few things that I want to alert you to for the rest of the day, and from what we've heard from this panel. When you go to the other panels and we come back, I'd like you to think about, how do you decide on what kind of research approach or research question you're going to have? Is it a program evaluation? Is it a policy analysis? Is this brand new research in terms of trying to inform new policies? Those are types of things you should be thinking about in terms of the examples that you're going to be seeing today. Another is the role of the media, the role of how do you get your message out? how do you get someone to talk about your work? What role does that play? Another is the role of aggregators. All these folks a lot of these are aggregators. So they're not individual researchers, they're in networks, they're in centers, they collaborate. So what role do aggregators play in terms of your ability to move the research out and for those who aren't practitioners in the audience to grab that information? So that's something else we should be thinking about during the day. And then we really do need to think about the role of APPAM. And if the whole purpose today is not just to talk to you about what foundations do or think tanks do and the importance of evidence-based or any other kind of research, but what is it that we need to be doing in APPAM to ensure that the expertise and knowledge that's resident in our members moves out of that academic setting into making some difference in the socioeconomic conditions of our country. So we'd like you to be thinking about that as you move through the day, and we'll get back at the very end and wrap this up. So I want to thank the panel for coming, and for all of you coming at 7:30 in the morning, but also just for taking your time to share this with us and to give us some ideas that it's a good launch for us to be thinking about the rest of the day. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.